Good Vach, everybody. Thank you so much for joining our webinar tonight. A good Vach to everybody. Tonight is the Master of Kabbalah and Amazing Stories of the Rebbe. You know, each and every one of us has two souls, a godly soul that sits in our brain and the right ventricle of our heart, and an animal soul that sits in the left ventricle of the heart. These two souls continuously fight. Where do we know this concept of the two souls? This comes from teachings of the Arizal, the 16th century Kabbalist whose yahrzeit is this evening. Amongst many other things that the Arizal taught us, he also taught us about reincarnation. And I think through his student Rav Chaim Vital, he authored, who actually wrote down most of his works, he shared with us the most amazing insights into spirituality. He said of Moses that Moshe Rabbeinu was a reincarnation of Abel, whom Cain killed. Hillel was a reincarnation of Moses. He said about himself that he was a reincarnation of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and of his student Rav Chaim Vital, he said he was a reincarnation of Rabbi Akiva. But to give us an insight into the life of the Arizal, we have Rabbi Hecht with us, who's going to give us the most amazing insight, and that's going to be followed by amazing stories of the Rebbe with Rabbi Alex Karlebach. So over to you guys. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you, Rabbi Masinta. Good Vach to all, and welcome to my good friend and colleague, Rabbi Karlebach. I begin with a disclaimer. The advertisement said, Master Kabbalist and Amazing Stories of the Rebbe. The amazing stories of the Rebbe will be told by Rabbi Karlebach, but I'm not the Master Kabbalist. The Master Kabbalist, as Rabbi Masinta mentioned, is of course the Holy Ari, the Arizal. So first let's begin with a little bit of background and perhaps one or two stories about the Ari. The Ari's name was Rabbi Yitzchak ben Shlomo Ashkenazi Luria. He was born in 1534 in Jerusalem, and tonight is his yahrzeit. He passed away 448 years ago tonight in Tzfat, in the holy city of Safed in the north of Israel. Before he was born, his father was visited by Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet. And he told him that he's going to have a son and he should name him Yitzchak, and that he, Eliyahu Hanavi, will be the standik at his bris. And he shouldn't make the bris until he comes and is the standik. Of course, this was very, very unusual. Rabbi Shlomo, who was his father, who was a rabbi and a dayan in Jerusalem at the time, waited for the birth. His wife gave birth to a little boy, and they had the bris all planned, and they were waiting and waiting and waiting, and Shlomo was waiting for Eliyahu Hanavi to come. Eventually, after much waiting, Eliyahu comes to him and says, "You sit down and be the sandik, and I will sit on top of you, and I'll hold the baby." Of course, nobody beheld, nobody saw Eliyahu Hanavi, but in fact, Eliyahu Hanavi was the sandik at the bris of the Ari. Rabbi Yitzchak ben Shlomo Luria was known as the Ari. Ari means the lion, but the actual acrostic for the name is Eloki Rabbi Yitzchak, the godly Rabbi Yitzchak. That title, godly, you will hardly find, if at all, on any other great Jewish leader of all times. There are great rabbis, Iluyim, Gaonim, etc., Rebbes, but the title Eloki is really very, very unique. And if I'm not mistaken, the only one other one we find it at is by the Tana Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, the author of the Zohar, who was also known as the Tana Eloki Rabbi Shimon. And I think Rabbi Masinta mentioned that in fact the Arizal, we are told, was a reincarnation of the Rashbi of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. When he was a young boy, his father passed away when he was very young, and his mother found it difficult to provide for her family, so she decided to move to Cairo. Cairo was a great center of Judaism at the time and of Torah learning. And the reason for that was that she had a brother there. Her brother was Rab Mordechai Francis. Rab Mordechai was a wealthy man. Francis is because he came from France. And she came to Cairo, and he, of course, supported her and helped her raise her children. In due course, in fact, the holy Ari, married his cousin, the daughter of Rab Mordechai Francis. His first teacher in Cairo was known as the Radbaz. The Radbaz is Rab David Ben Zimra, one of the greatest halachists and commentaries of all times. And he was the teacher of the Ari, by whom he learned for approximately 5 or 6 years. After that, he studied under Rabbi Bitzalel Ashkenazi, the author of the Shita Mikubetzes. In fact, it is told that he authored part of the Shita Mikubetzes himself. The Ari was one of the authors of it, but some of his contributions were lost or destroyed, and so they never made it into the final editions of the Shita Mikubetzes. This is one of the greatest and most important commentaries, running commentaries on the entire Talmud. At about that time, in his young 20s, he was introduced to the Zohar and started to commit himself to the study of the Zohar, which is the first and foremost, the most basic book of Jewish mysticism, and he committed himself to it completely. So much so that for 6 or 7 years, he separated himself in meditation and in studying of Kabbalah, where an entire week he would be away from home, near the river, or some say on an island, and he would come home only on Shabbos and would not speak anything. If he had to say something and it was important, he would speak only in Hebrew to his wife. But other than that, he meditated and was secluded for 6 days a week, and this is for 6 or 7 years running. And we understand that during this time, he was taught the secrets of the Torah, the mystical secrets of the Torah, by Eliyahu Hanavi, who was his mentor and his teacher. When he reached the age of about 35 or 36, he was directed by heaven that it's time for him to move to Israel. So he packed his things and journeyed to Israel, first into Yerushalayim, and he was there for a short while, but then he moved up to Tzfat, to the city of Safed, which at the time was a great center of Torah learning and of mystical teaching. The great teacher of Moshe Kardavoy, known as the Ramak, was approximately 10 years older than the Arizal and the Ari, and the Ari studied under Ramak for a number of months. That didn't last too long because there was a plague, unfortunately, in Tzfas, in northern Israel, and the Ramak unfortunately died at a young age, also of about 50 or somewhere in that vicinity. After the passing of the Ramak, of Rav Moshe Kardavoy, it was obvious that the Arizal, Rav Yitzchak Luria, the Holy Ari, would become the leader and the teacher of the school of Kabbalah. The Arizal taught, he had a group of students who he taught. Foremost amongst them was Rab Chaim Vital. The Ari himself did not record, did not write his teachings. Rab Chaim Vital, his prize student, recorded most of his teachings, known as the Kitvei Ari, the writings of Ari, the Eitz Chaim, the Pri-Eitz Chaim, the different Shaorim, Shara Gilgulim, etc., etc. And this massive work, body of work, contains the teachings and the understanding of Kabbalah, of the mystical teachings of the Torah, according to the Ari. Now, in Tzfas at that time, it was a very interesting place to be. because some of the greatest names of Jewish law and Jewish mysticism and Jewish commentary lived there together at the same time and were colleagues. So we had the author of the Shulchan Aruch, Rabbi Yosef Karo. We had, together with him, we had Rabbi Moshe Alshich, Rabbeinu Moshe Alshich, who wrote the commentary on the Torah, Torat Moshe. There was Rabbi Shlomo Alkabatz, the author of the Lecha Dodi, which we sing Friday night. As we mentioned, there was Rabbi Chaim Vital, and there was the Ari. So imagine, if you will, for a moment, spending a Shabbos in Tzvas some 475 years ago. The rabbi in town, in the shul, was the Beis Yosef, the author of the Shulchan Aruch. The preacher, the one who would give the drushes, was Rav Moshe Alshich. The Chazan, the Shliach Tzibur, was Rav Shlomo Elkabatz, the one who authored Lecha Dodi. And Fabreng would Fabreng the Arizal and teach us the secrets and the mystical teachings of the Torah. Could you imagine being there for a Shabbos, Friday night, walking into the fields with the Ari and his colleagues? What a Shabbos that must have been. It is told about one of his colleagues, I think it was the Alshich, that when he was a young man and early married, he would get up every night, I suppose at about midnight, to pray the Tikkun Chatzot, which is the prayer which great people, holy people say every night at midnight when they bemoan and they cry over the destruction of the temple. Ordinary people like ourselves do this on Tisha B'Av. But the great minds and hearts and souls of the Jewish people would have this prayer every midnight of Tikkun Chatzot, when they would bemoan and cry over the Beit HaMikdash, the destruction. And after that, he would sit down to learn. And about 4 o'clock in the morning, his wife would bring him a cup of tea. Unfortunately, his wife passed away very young. And so it was organized that another young woman would bring him a cup of tea at about 4 a.m. every morning in the shul, in the Beis Medrash. The first night or morning, she brings him a cup of tea. Very happy, thanks her. The next day, she brings 2 cups of tea. All right. And so it goes on for 2 or 3 days. Instead of bringing 1 cup of tea, she brings 2 cups of tea. Eventually, the rabbi, Rav Moshe, asks whoever it was who arranged to find out, why is she bringing 2 cups of tea? So the young woman answered, well, there are 2 people learning together. So I'm bringing a cup of tea for each of them. At which time, the holy Alshich said, if that's the case, then you ask the woman if she would marry me. Because what happened was that every night, Eliyahu HaNavi would come and study with the Alshich. Nobody else beheld, nobody else saw who was studying. But when he realized that this young woman had such holy eyes that she was able to see Eliyahu HaNavi, he immediately asked if he could marry her, and of course she agreed and he married her. So we had this group of great minds and hearts and souls of Israel who lived together in Tzvat at the time. Sadly, the Arizal only lived in Tzvat for about 2 years, during which time, as I said, he taught and opened up the books of Kabbalah, the works of Kabbalah, the teachings of Kabbalah. He not only opened it up, but he taught that the time has now come, that this teaching should be spread out and open for the masses, because until that time, the Kabbalah was a very, very secretive and unique teaching studied only in small groups by elite people and students of the Torah. And the Arizal said, mitzvah legalot zot hachachma, the time has come to reveal this chachma. And the reason is because, we all believe that Mashiach is going to come, and hopefully he'll come soon. If he can make it here before Thursday, we'll avoid fasting on Tisha B'Av. So hopefully he'll get his GPS right and get here soon. But the coming of Mashiach, although is the ultimate, the goal of everything, it's a process. And the world has to be prepared for Mashiach. When Mashiach comes, he's going to teach us the secrets of the Torah. As the Rambam ends off in his final chapter and paragraph, that in the days of Mashiach, all of us, every Jew, will be occupied in studying about God and godliness, the secrets of the Torah. And this is not going to happen just overnight, but this was a process. And the process began, or was promoted by the Arizal when he said that now has come the time to promote and to expose the teachings of the Kabbalah. And from that, eventually grew the Hasidic movement, and we have the proliferation of the teachings of Hasidus and Kabbalah as a preparation for Mashiach. When Mashiach comes, we're told, as we said in our prayers today, we pray to God, we say it at the end of benching, God should bring us the days of Mashiach, which are all Shabbos. Now, there's an interesting law in Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch says that before Shabbos, there's a mitzvah to taste the foods of Shabbos. So when the men go into the kitchen and have a little nibble of the kugel, or whatever it should be, that's okay. It's even a mitzvah. And so we're taught that before Mashiach comes, before the great Shabbos, and when he's going to teach us the ultimate secrets of the Torah, there is a mitzvah to taste that beforehand. And that's what the Arizal started to do. He started to give us a taste of the teachings of Mashiach. This was expanded on by the Baal Shem Tov, the Alter Rebbe, and by all the Rebbes of the Hasidic movements in general and Chabad in particular. Every soul has a mission in this world. God would not send us down if we didn't have to accomplish something, and we understand that every soul has a unique mission. Of course, we all have to do the Torah, we have to keep Shabbos, we have to eat kashrus, we have to daven, we have to pray, put on film, give charity. But everyone has a unique mission in this world. Baal Shem Tov told us that a soul could come down to this world and spend 70 or 80 years for the sole purpose of doing a favor to one Jew one time, for material things and especially in spiritual things. But there are special souls. There are souls that come down to this world. They are chosen by God to be game changers, to change the course of history, of Jewish history, of Jewish learning. We had many greats. We have greats, but not everyone is on that level chosen by God to change the course of history. We had a Moshe Rabbeinu, Avraham Avinu, David HaMelech, Rabbeinu HaKadosh, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasir, the prince who recorded the Mishnah, Ravina Ravashi, who wrote the Talmud, the Rambam, Rashi, and then there was the Arizal, who totally changed the course of Jewish history. And we had the Baal Shem Tov, and now we have the Rebbe. Each who brought a major change in Jewish life and in Jewish history and in Jewish direction. And so this is a little background of the holy Eloki Rabbi Yitzchak. I just want to end off with a story, a very short story about his passing, about the Arizal's death. And I read it to you from an old book written in 1945 by a group of rabbis. And this was contribution made by one Rabbi Bernard Berzon, who was one of a very prominent rabbi in Brooklyn, well-known rabbi. And I'll just read it to you. And this refers to the last moments, or to his final days or his final year in this world. There is a remarkable legend told about the mystical and saintly personality Rabbi Isaac Ben Solomon Ashkenazi Luria, commonly known as the Ari, founder of modern Kabbalah. After the Kol Nidre service one Yom Kippur night, the rabbi found himself all alone in the synagogue in Tzfat in Israel. All the people departed long ago, but the Ari was still wrapped in deep meditation on the sacred night. Suddenly he beheld in the distance near the ark a tall, gaunt, and awe-inspiring figure, all garbed in black. Despite the fear and apprehension which gripped the holy man at the sight of such a dreadful a being, the Ari made his way in the direction of the ark. As he came closer and looked deep into the eyes of that strange creature, the Ari recognized the identity of the stranger and exclaimed, "You are the Malach HaMavos," he said, "the angel of death." The gaunt figure nodded his head in assent. "I have come," he said, "to take the lives of those who appear on my list." The angel of death held the list in his hands and showed it to the rabbi. The holy man was horror-stricken when he beheld the names of the most illustrious people of Safat on that death list. Like Jacob, who struggled with the angel at Yabok, the rabbi began to wrestle with the Malach HaMavos in an effort to get hold of that list. As dawn began to break, the Ari, bruised and battered, managed to snatch the list out of the clutches of the angel of death. And in the corner lay the Malach HaMavos, defeated, but with a diabolic smile on his ugly face. For in his clenched fist, he still held a torn piece of that paper upon which was inscribed the name of the Ari himself. Thus, the rabbi saved every one of his people, but failed to save himself. There's a lot to learn from this story, but tonight's we're not learning from the stories, we're just relating the stories. I can't vouch for it, but I read it to you. And so even in his passing, he made sure that everybody else survived. But his legacy lives on, and as I mentioned, his legacy is one that prepares us for the coming of Mashiach, and may it be soon, speedily in our day. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to hearing from the other contributors tonight.
Thank you, Rabbi Hecht, and a good vach to everybody. That was a very moving account of the Arizal. I understand too, Rabbi Hecht, maybe you can verify that there are many graves, let's say where the Rashbi himself is buried, where all the different Tanoim Amoraim are buried, that we know from the Arizal who went around and marked them out. Have you ever heard such a thing?
Yes, it seems that it was a favorite pastime of the Ari and some of his colleagues. They would go out into the fields and he would take his stick and give a knock on the ground and he'd say, "Over here lies Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseda or Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai." And so all those graves in the northern Galilee in Israel, which people visit and pray at, first and foremost, as you say, of the Rashbi himself, were identified by the Arizal.
Yeah. It's amazing when you think about it, that his whole time in Tzfas and teaching his Kabbalistic teachings were in ganzen 2.5 years. That's
If
like,
that, yeah.
it's
If
like
that.
54 months or so. Think we've been in lockdown already close to 5 months. That's like 10% of the time that he taught all his teachings, and how he has really affected and impacted the world. Even the siddur we have is the Nusach Arizal.
Very much so. In fact, there are so many aspects of Jewish law and custom which come from the Ari, which many people don't realize. The very Kabbalat Shabbat service, we start with Lechuna Ranana, comes from the Arizal. For the Rabbi Yosef Karo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, who was a colleague of his, the fact that the Ari did something and practiced something was enough to make it law. And many of the laws are based on the customs of the Ari. As I just said, for instance, the whole Friday night service until Mizmar LeDavid was introduced by the Ari and Rab Shlomo Alkabatz. For instance, in the month of Elul, which is not all that far away, it's less than a month away, we begin saying Psalm 27 every day, in the morning and in the evening, Shachris and Mincha, some have it Shachris and Ma'ariv. Where did that come from? Who introduced that to the Siddur? That's all from the Arizal. And so many and other things which have become part and parcel of our daily routine and our weekly and Yom Tov routines stem and could be traced back to the Ari. You know, you asked about his short life and only in 2 years. Well, for one thing, it shows us that if you're really committed, you could do a great amount in 2 years. You don't need all that much time. And he did exactly what he had to do. Why didn't he live longer? I mean, that's up to God. But as I mentioned before, his mission was to teach the Kabbalah and to open it up to the masses and to prepare us for Mashiach. Could you imagine, had he been around for another 10 years, there would have been so much light, so much holiness, that it just would have, as in his words, because one of the ideas that the Ari presented was the concept of the breaking of the vessels, the Shvirat HaKelim. I think it was a concept which was unknown in the Kabbalah beforehand, or not discussed very much. And it's the Ari who teaches us about the world was given exactly the amount of exposure to Kabbalah as it needed at that time. Some 150 years later, the Baal Shem Tov came and increased the dosage. A little bit later, 2 generations later, the Alter Rebbe, Rav Shneur Zalman, came and increased the dosage a little bit more. And through the 7 generations of Hasidic movement, especially in Chabad, each Rebbe increased the dosage slightly more and gave us new angles and new ideas in Hasidus to prepare us for the Mashiach. And it would seem to many that we're at the threshold right now. They have gone to the point where they can go. They can't go any further. And now the Mashiach has to come and take us past the finishing line.
Amen, Rabbi. And today being the day of his yahrzeit, Hey of Mazole Gover, may he truly accomplish everything, as you say, including Mashiach's coming. Well, mainly Mashiach's coming. A good Wacht, everybody. And tonight I'd like to share a few stories of the Rebbe. And the first one I'd like to share is a very famous one, and it's told by a Rabbi Hirsch Weinreb. I'm sure many people may have heard the story, but it happened in the early 70s, in about 1971. Rabbi Hirsch Weinreb, who went on to become a very renowned rabbi working at the OU and other places like that, was then a young man in his 30s living in Silver Lake, Maryland. And he says he was a young rabbi. He also had certain college degrees, and he had many questions about his future. First of all, his oldest child needed a Torah education. He was looking into whether he should stay there or not stay there. He was looking into whether he should further his studies and his degrees, what he should do as a rabbi. And then he says, in addition to that, being a young man, he had many questions in his faith, in his emunah that you go through. He says he was too young for a midlife crisis, or maybe he was just hitting it early, but he had many, many questions. And he didn't know how to answer them. but he had heard about the Lubavitcher Rebbe and his greatness. So he picked up the phone and he phoned up the Rebbe's secretaries, and he spoke in Yiddish. And the things he said is, Ich bin a Yid from Maryland. I am a Jew from Maryland, and I have all these questions that I'd like to ask. And actually, I'm sorry, he didn't even say who he is or where he's from. He just said he has many questions that he'd like clarified by the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And he heard, my friends, many times the Rebbe had an extension phone to his secretaries. And during conversations, he would speak on the phone. And Rabbi Weinreb had known enough about the Rebbe to recognize his voice. And he heard that obviously the Rebbe must have heard also all the questions. So he said, Wer redt? Who is speaking? And he was very careful not to mention his name, he said, Ayid from Maryland. There's a Jew from Maryland speaking. So the Rebbe said, Ebazei, if that's the case, there is a rabbi in Silver Springs by the name of Weinreb, and go speak to this Weinreb. So he sounds confused, he says, and he thinks to himself, I know for sure I did not mention my name. So he says, aber ich bin Weinreb. I myself am Weinreb. So now the secretary was confused. And he said, didn't know what to say. So the Rebbe said, Ebazei, if so, darf reden zu sich. He should speak to himself. So the secretary says to Rabbi Weinreb, did you hear what the Rebbe said? And he wanted to hear it again. He thought he was maybe imagining. So he says, no, I didn't hear. So the secretary repeated verbatim, Amol darf man reden zu sich, that there are times you have to speak to yourself. And he said those few words were so powerful and made such an impact upon him that when he got off the phone, he put himself into solitude and he began asking himself the questions. It's an amazing thing that in truth, there are times that we may have questions, we're looking for direction, and you know who has the answers? Ourselves, but we don't know how to find it. And the greatest thing is to search within. If you have a very good friend, a mashpia, maybe they can help you search within. But this is what the Rebbe was saying. And he says he took those words and it became very important for the rest of his life. Many, many times, whenever he had questions, and he says even in halacha, when he had questions, he would take himself off to solitude and he would think of what the Rebbe said. And to connect himself to the Rebbe, he says, he would take out a talk of the Rebbe and learn something, and in that way find clarity. And it helped him throughout his life. And I think, friends, this is a lesson to all of us. We shouldn't be afraid to talk to ourselves. Although the world says if you see someone talking to himself, you know what that means. So maybe don't do it in public. Go into a private room and think to yourself your questions, even if sometimes you have to write it down so that you are able to look at it more objective. And that was what the Rebbe was teaching us all. You know, my friends, it's amazing. Yeah.
Could I add something? Can I interrupt and add something? I came across in the Rebbe's letters And this is from 1974. In fact, the 15th of Tammuz, 1974. And it's not a letter, it's an answer. In other words, it was an informal letter where also a rabbi writes to him. I'll give you the name at the end of the story for obvious reasons. This person writes to the Rebbe that he's going through a difficult time, and he asks that the Rebbe, and he writes in Yiddish, soll helfen und tun alles, that the Rebbe should do everything to help him. The Rebbe answers him as follows, and I'm going to read the answer it's on page 203, volume 29 of the Rebbe's letters. The Rebbe answers, Terem yikra'u va'ani ene, quotes the verse in Isaiah, which says, before you called out to me, I already answered. In other words, the Rebbe says, your question that I should help, I already answered you. Mikvar osisi ka'atzosai. I did exactly as you suggest. V'nishlach l'sham, and I sent there, because this letter came from New Haven. And he says, I sent to New Haven a Rav Moshe Yitzchak Sheich Hecht. I sent there Rabbi Hecht, Moshe Hecht, to go to New Haven. So I already sent the messenger who will give you the answers. And it would seem from this letter and the previous letter you wrote to me, says the Rebbe, that you still didn't meet this Rabbi Hecht. And the talents and the gifts which were given to him and his energy. But at least now, at least now make an effort to meet and to be acquainted with this Rabbi Hecht. And as soon as you will meet him, says the Rebbe, everything will change. Your mood, your faith in God, and your joy of life every day. And of course, who wrote the letter was Rabbi Hecht himself. And the Rebbe writes to him, I sent Rabbi Hecht there, why don't you meet him? In other words, as Rabbi Kalbach was just pointing out from the story with Rabbi Weinreb, that sometimes the solution to our problems, we don't have to look very far. It's right there in our own hearts and minds. We just have to concentrate. We just have to, look deeply into ourselves in a very honest way. And we will find that we ourselves have the answers and have the solutions to many, many of our problems. I yield back to you, Rabbi. Sorry for interrupting.
Thank you for that story of your uncle. It truly is a very beautiful one and an important lesson. I would like to point out also that the Rebbe cared about all people, everybody. And it wasn't even exclusive to Jewish people. Rabbi Groner tells an amazing story that Rabbi Klein, Oliver Sholem, told him, both Oliver Sholem, sadly, that after 94 at the Ohel, Rabbi Klein was there and he saw a black couple coming there, pouring out their hearts, praying and crying. At first, he thought
Rabbi Kalbach, we don't hear you.
there, pouring out their hearts, praying and
Alex.
crying. At first, he thought
Rabbi Kalbach, we don't hear you.
I'm going to call him on the other phone. Guys, just hang in there. Yossi, why don't you just share another story while we're waiting?
It has to come to mind. Rabbi Kalbach back. Rabbi Kalbach was speaking about Rabbi Hirsch Weinreb, and as he said, the story was quite a well-known story. In fact, Rabbi Weinreb was a guest here at the Sinai and Daba a few years ago. In fact, that year, Sinai and Daba began on the Saturday night, and it was the 3rd of Tammuz, which is the yard site of the Rebbe. And Rabbi Weinreb himself told that story at the opening session of the Sinai and Daba. So it's a true story. And it's, as he said, it's one that has affected his entire life. Rabbi Weinreb went on to become the editor of the Steinsaltz Talmud. And in the last 10 years approximately, he spearheaded the project to translate the Steinsaltz Talmud, which was Rabbi Steinsaltz translated the Talmud from the Aramaic into the Hebrew, and he then spearheaded the project to translate it from the Hebrew into the English by Koren Press. And it has been concluded, and it was a very, very successful project. Rabbi Kalbach, are you back on? You have to unmute yourself. Speaking about the Steinsaltz Talmud, if you happen to come across a copy of the very, very first edition, you'll see in it as that the whole project was a brainchild of the Rebbe and Rabbi Steinsaltz, and the Rebbe gave him many, many instructions how to do it. And it was with the Rebbe's blessings that this happens to be one of the great projects of the 20th century, translating the Talmud into Hebrew, and as I said, by Rabbi Weinreb, from the Hebrew into the English. Rabbi Kalbach, are you there?
Yeah, how far did I get? I don't know what happened.
You're at the place where the couple was at the oil.
A black couple at the oil, yeah.
There was a black couple at the oil, and they were crying. Rabbi Klein asked them what was wrong, and they told him that their son was in a accident, a motorbike accident, and that the doctors feared the worst, and they had prayed so hard. 2 weeks later, Rabbi Klein was at the Ohel again, and he saw the same couple, but this time with big smiles and happy. And he said, "What happened?" He says, "You won't believe it. A couple of hours after we came back to the hospital from the Ohel, my son had miraculously taken a turn for the better, something that confounded all the doctors. And yesterday, he managed to come home, which was unheard of, that 13 days after such a big accident, he would come home. And we came to thank the Rebbe for this. As I say, he was cared not just about even the Jewish people, but the entire world, to the degree that in 1986 in Mem Vov, he started to press for Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, that we should get involved with the entire world and teach them about Torah. And this is what Rabbi Mesinta does so well with his random acts of kindness and his webinars that gets everyone involved. So I'd like to just share a personal story before I get to another one of the Rebbe, and that was the last white mayor of Johannesburg was David Nepi, Oliver Sholm. And the late David Nepi was very instrumental in our shul. He was one of the first families I met. He helped us build the shul. And when he became mayor, he made me his chaplain. And one of the times that one of the events that happened as the chaplain was King Goodwill Zwelithini was coming to Johannesburg, and David Nepi was hosting him at the Civic Center and making a big party. The Rebbe had just come out with the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, with encouraging everybody to get involved and to bring the whole world to perfection. And so I was at that event. So I told David that if you'd like, there's a certain blessing that you give to kings. If you see the Queen of England, you make a blessing, and the blessing is that Hashem has given part of his respect, part of his portion to kings in the physical world. So I remember, I think it was Rabbi Weinberg that I asked if I can make such a bracha on King Goodwill Swallatini. And he smiled and he said, you know, this king probably has more power than the Queen of England. So yes, you can make the bracha. So I told David, if you'd like, at the beginning of the event, when the king comes in, I will address the crowd, tell them a little bit about the 7 laws of Noach, the universal code, and say this blessing. And he thought it was a great idea. And so I did. You should have seen the entrance. Everyone was bowing down and a ganze Geschichte. At the party, the king approached me, very well spoken. He's an Oxford graduate, a very intellectual man. And he says, Rabbi, I want you to know that this is the first time that anybody blessed me in the original language of the Bible. And I appreciate it very much. It meant a lot to me. So you see how the effect of the Rebbe was on not only on Jewish people, but on everybody. To the extent, I'm reading here that on the 25th anniversary of the Rebbe's yahrzeit, supermodel Naomi Campbell shared a personal photo of herself praying at the grave of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And it says, Campbell appeared to be holding a prayer book as she stood at the final resting place. The British-born beauty shared that Schneerson, who is often referred to as the Rebbe, had a profound impact on her life as she visited his queen's gravesite to gain blessing and inspiration. And then she adds, I would not normally show my prayers at the Lubavitcher Rebbe's resting place, but since I was snapped, I decided to put it out myself. And she goes on to share more about the Rebbe's influence on her life in a second post. She says, the Rebbe, an inspirational leader, scholar, and teacher. The Rebbe taught that we are all inherently good, and we have the potential to change the world for the better, one good deed at a time. I have personally learned so much from his wisdom and teachings while I never met him. But, she adds, with so much discord and division across our society, the Rebbe's words are more relevant than ever. And we so desperately need to take them to heart and learn from his example to always see the good in others, even those with whom we may disagree. Today, she writes, I rededicate myself to the Rebbe's lifelong mission of creating more light and goodness and making a better future for ourselves and all humanity. And then they add that Campbell was not the only celebrity to honor the Rebbe's memory. Paula Abdul shared a message about the Rebbe's Shabbos Candle campaign, which encourages all Jewish women and girls to mark the start of Shabbos by lighting candles. And she writes that tonight is 25 years since his passing. His teachings to better our world through unconditional love are more urgent now than ever. Join me in his Shabbos candle campaign, spreading light before sundown this evening, which is quite a remarkable homage to the Rebbe, but especially today, when we see, and we're living in a time, you see what's going on in America with all the discord and all the problems that are going on, and how the impact of the Rebbe, he says, is the focus of all spiritual wisdom, is to transform this world. And the Rebbe cared about each and every person. I read a story today of a artist, Ralph Norell. Maybe I don't have time to tell you the entire story, but he had a daughter who was born, and just the punchline is that until she was 4 years old, she couldn't talk. And they thought the worst. They didn't know what to think. And someone convinced them, they lived in London, and someone convinced them when they were going to have treatment done in America to take her past the Rebbe. And at that time, when the Rebbe went to Mincha, he went from his office. Anybody who knows 770, they know there's a little hallway, and he went into the small shul, and people would stand there as the Rebbe passed by, and a lot of children would stand there, and the Rebbe would give them coins to put into the pushka. Generally, the Rebbe gave the coins and just walked on, but he stared at this girl. And then he looked at the father to say, even though the girls and the men were separated, to say, I know that it is who you are and the connection, and that everything will turn out. And the miracles happened, that she was able to talk, and she became the most wonderful, lively girl in the most miraculous way. And this guy, Ralph Norell, he was a famous artist. He had painted the Shah. He was Iranian, and he had painted many others. And after these miracles with the Rebbe, he decided to make a painting of the Rebbe. He actually did it from photographs. And when he painted the Rebbe, he tried to put everything into it. And when they then showed it to the Rebbe said, there is something wrong with it. He had his hands together in a way that Jews don't. He asked him to please remake the hands. And when he did, he said there was just a spirituality that came out of that painting. And you saw the concern that the Rebbe had of all people. And as Rabbi Hecht pointed out, every neshama comes here for a unique purpose in life. And it is very difficult to find sometimes what your purpose is. The Rebbe was able to focus on each individual and see the good. Sometimes people were surprised how the Rebbe would use many other people who they couldn't understand. The guy is a chveis vos. How can he use him? But the Rebbe saw the positive. He saw the good in people, and he saw their strengths, and he was able to focus in on them and to bring that out in the most miraculous way. I'd like to conclude with another personal story and the Rebbe. And that is, we lived in New York. Actually, after we got married, we actually rented our flat from Rabbi Hecht's family. We were on top of Pardes Chana, across the street from 770 at 733. And my mother-in-law had come from England and had met the Rebbe in Yechidus. That's a story in its own. But a year later or so, our daughter Shana was born. and my mother-in-law came for that birth, and she wanted to see the Rebbe. But at that time, the Rebbe wasn't accepting visitors. Like the last time she had seen the Rebbe, he was. In fact, the Rebbe gave her a little siddur that she carries till today with his signature in it, a soft-covered siddur. But this year, she couldn't she couldn't go into a private audience with the Rebbe. So we told her that if you want to see the Rebbe, stand there in that alcove in the entrance of 770 when the Rebbe passes from his office to Mincha, and there you could see him. I don't know if anyone knows how quickly the Rebbe walks. He was carrying his siddur in one hand, and he just looks at who's and nods his head. He looks who's in the alcove, nods his head, then he goes out to Mincha. My mother-in-law had given a donation to Merkas, to the Rebbe's office, and she then got a receipt and a letter of the Rebbe thanking her for the donation. And then it says, P.S. It was nice to see you again, even though just for a brief moment. Now, you know what that is. The Rebbe had seen her in a Yechidus over a year before. You have any idea how many people the Rebbe sees in that time? And here she stood there. He saw her maybe for 2 seconds. And in his letter, he writes, it was nice to see you even for a brief moment. And she actually has that letter together with the siddur, and she says Shema from it every night. And I think that that story is not just about the genius and the memory of the Rebbe. And I often think, here I am at a young age of 65, and I'm already going over bottle. My memory is certainly not what it used to be. The Rebbe Kanayan Hara was beyond the natural. His memory never, ever failed him, ever. The things he would remember, there's countless of stories of letters he remembered, and all those type of things. But that's not, to me, the issue. The issue is how much he cared for each person, especially those who were in front of him, whoever came in front of him, and he was focused on them continuously. And even if it was for a brief second, he knew exactly when he had seen them, where he had seen them. And I said that would be the last story, but I'll tell you one more quick story. I was told that an Israeli once came to visit the Rebbe, and he gave his, when you came into Yechidus, you gave a letter to the Rebbe, a handwritten letter. And the Rebbe said, you wrote me before. And he says, I'm sorry, but you must be mistaken. I have never written you before. The Rebbe says, you have. There were like a little argument. The Rebbe says, you wrote me, and he says, I didn't. So the Rebbe goes into his drawer and pulls out a letter, and he hands it to the man. The man looks at him, at the letter, and he gets white. He sees it's in his handwriting, and he remembers what happened. He was in war with another soldier, and that soldier was wounded. Not sure if they were in hospital together or whatever, but the soldier's hand was wounded and he couldn't write. And he wanted to ask the Rebbe for a blessing. So he turned around to this other person and he said, do me a favor. Will you be my scribe? Just write these words to the Rebbe for me. And then the wounded person had signed it himself. So here the Rebbe had recognized the handwriting of this person, even though it wasn't his signature, It was written in his handwriting, and the Rebbe was able to show him how not only was he focused on the person, but even on every action of a person, even his handwriting. As Rabbi Hecht mentioned, tonight is the yahrzeit of the Arizal. It is the Arizal who also taught us about the power of a tzaddik, of a Rebbe, that continues even after they leave the world. And the Arizal writes in one of his Shar Ruach HaKodesh that the power of a tzaddik is that generally when a person passes away, there's 5 levels of the soul, and the nefesh part stays with the body for the first year, and then really more or less departs. There's just an imprint. But with a tzaddik, the nefesh continues to connect for the neshama eternally. And whenever you go to the grave of a tzaddik, he writes, and you pray there, the nefesh of that tzaddik connects to the neshama, and he sees and he knows what is going on. And he's continuously, the shepherd of Israel, continuously thinks and cares about his flock. And that is why I would so strongly urge anybody, till today, there's the most amazing way that we can connect to the Rebbe by going to either rebbe@ol.org or ol@ol.org. You could look it up on chabad.org, and it'll tell you all the ways to write to the Rebbe. And my friends, know the Rebbe wants to hear from us, and the Rebbe is as effective as he has always been. Anybody who has any difficulties, any simchas, any type of news, anything to report, it is beneficial to connect to the Rebbe, and in that way, know blessings in your life. A good vach. Thank you.
Good Vach, Rabbi Hector, Rabbi Karlebach, thank you so much for giving of your time and even also your inspiration, which is much needed at this time. So thank you. It truly was an informative and enjoyable and inspiring evening. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
To all who joined in, thank you. Please join us tomorrow night as we take a trip to Germany with Rabbi Teichtel, the Shliach in Berlin. It's certainly not to be missed. Have a great evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I don't know what happened there.